we're now going to take a look at some advanced bump mapping for different grasses and basically any sort of vegetation that has a single leaf, or in this case blades, for the materials. What I'm going to do is I just have a scene open that was the first ecosystem that I created. I'm going to go ahead and remove the grasses for the moment, and I'm going to be replacing them with a new one. What I'm going to do is change the scale of this terrain to 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters with a height of, let's go ahead and use 2 centimeters, so that we have a smaller area that we're working with. Because what I'm going to end up doing is creating an ecosystem and converting it to objects, just so that after we make any changes, if we want to see them right away, even though we could just render in order to see the preview, if we decide to close out the material editor, we don't have to wait for the ecosystem to refresh. So if we go to the material, now what I've done is created an alternate version of the BO1 grass, one of the denser ones, and what I've done is just gotten rid of the material variations, so just went and copied and pasted the same material in all the subsets. This way we can just edit the bump channel of one material and see it reflected throughout. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my maximum size variation, just get rid of it completely, and increase the density. Let's try 98. Let's go ahead and force regular alignment of instances. And that should be good. So we can click OK, and I'm going to go up to the instance selector. This is only available within the standalone version of Vue, so if you're using Extreme Integrated, you will have to open the standalone in order to use this tool. What I'm going to do is select all of the instances and convert to objects. So now we have all of the grass as objects. This is also a cool way to find out exactly how many variations of each ecosystem species are created when you generate an ecosystem. With this species, the lily of the valley, the original source species, there are 8 variations or 8 objects that are created when you populate an ecosystem. Those 8 copies are then oriented in different ways and scaled in different ways in order to create more variations, but the base geometry is 8 variations, so 8 objects. There are other ways to be able to preview how many variations are created, judging on the amount of materials created. It is nice to know how many copies you will get out of certain species, and it ranges from species to species. If I just create a new scene really quick, and I do want to show this because it is pretty important. What I can do is just take this terrain, add an ecosystem. I'm going to add a plant, and we're going to go ahead and select the maple tree. We'll populate it, and you really can't see the variations. And when we take a look in the ecosystem materials, there's only one material. But if we edit that material and change it to an ecosystem, which in this case it won't let us do. The reason for that is obviously it's not compatible. So what I can do instead is first edit the species. In Vue 8 this was a lot easier to do, or possibly prior versions, because you used to be able to edit individual objects, the vegetation, customize them, and they removed that functionality because it was a little touchy. But it was kind of nice, and hopefully we'll get that back at some point. So what we need to do is load in the maple tree. change that over to an ecosystem for the maple leaf, edit the object, save the object, and I'm going to save this one in my grass directory, and that way it won't overwrite anything, and we'll just replace it. And you will need to do this for any species you're testing to see how many variations are created, because one of the materials has to have an ecosystem layer in order to trigger what you'll just see in a sec. So we're going to remove that plant, add a new one, that rural maple tree with an ecosystem layer, populate, and under materials, if we take a look at the ecosystem materials, what you can see is there's one material created for every single variation. So that's another way to be able to take a look and see it, how many variations are created. Some have as little as 4, some have even higher. I've seen, I think, up to 18, 16 or 18 for some of the more simple species. And basically, the more complex it is, the less variations you get. So that's one way to basically see how many objects and how many actual bits of geometry there are, because that's important. Wind is going to affect each individual object and not each individual instance. So you could have duplicated wind if your orientation isn't set up correctly, and that's why you also notice a lot of objects looking the same. So back on our grass scene, we're going to remove that ecosystem from the terrain, go over to the material tab, and then we can see the grass blade. So what we're going to do is create a custom bump channel for this. First, let's go ahead and take a look at a render without the bump. First, I'm going to edit the material, go to the bump channel, and reset the function that's on there. So now we're going to see absolutely no bump showing up. Okay, so here is render, no bump channel at all. When we get closer, we're going to want to see a little bit of bump. So we can set this up to be pretty lightweight so that it's not taking a long time to render, and by using the internal noises, Vue's noise nodes, we should be able to avoid any flickering, because it does auto-compensate for certain scales of noises, provided the render settings are good enough. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so that we can see the grass a little closer. Let's go back to our material, and we're going to edit the leaf, and let's go ahead and set our depth to 1. If you're using Vue 8 and lower, this value may need to be set to 5 in order to see what I'm going to be showing, at least the intensity. So we're using an object parametric mode, and this is important. This really will only work with the object parametric mode or object standard, typically object parametric. So make sure that your mapping mode is set to that. We're going to go to edit the function, and what we're going to do is, well, one thing is I am going to replace with the higher res alphas and the higher res grass material that I had created, since we're a lot closer. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to create just kind of lines on or along the grass. So what we can do for this is remove some of the other axes. Okay, so I'm going to set the scale to 0.1, and I've set the wavelength on the X and the Z to 0. Y is set to 1. I might need to do that actually on the X. Okay, so we'll set the X to 1, and then Y and Z are 0. Basically, only Y, or X and Y, are being used in the parametric mode in this case. So connecting that to the bump, this is going to be pretty intense. We'll let that finish rendering out. It is a bit too strong, but we're going to be mixing it with other noises. So just to see what the vertical lines look like, we'll let that render out. So you can see, pretty interesting. Like I said, the depth is too great. In this case, I am going to end up mixing this with different fractals. So in this case, you might want to use a value that's much lower, dividing it maybe by 10 if you were just going to stick with this specific noise. What I'm going to do is go back into the function, add another noise node, and we're going to use Math Patterns Tooth Gaussian. We're going to set the scale to 1, and let's just take a look with this new Gaussian. I also am going to add another filter, or a filter between the link, and set that to the opposite. So this is going to be the primary shaping of the filter, or the primary shaping of the bump, which is basically going to curve the look of each individual blade of grass. So that as we adjust this specific noise, we can blend it with other things and get different types of curvatures. We can filter it out. But right now it adds a bit more depth to the polygons that are created for the grass blades. So we definitely have a lot more depth and highlight variation now. I do want to note that because I already had the other noise selected when I created this one, the wavelength of Y and Z were set to 0 to match the other one. So if you were to close out the function and then open it and create a new noise, those will not be applied. So making sure that that also has the Y and Z set to 0. Another thing we could do, which is a cool filter, we're going to switch this over to the absolute. So add a filter, use the absolute, and this is going to give us a little more curvature, or kind of a dip in the center. So we can adjust, just looking in the function node preview on the X and seeing what that bump is going to look like. So the contrast is going to be the intensity of it. And then as we adjust the threshold, we can adjust that dip. Now if you apply this before the opposite filter, you can see that it is going to modify it a little differently. And we might end up with some pretty sharp peaks, but let's go ahead and take a look at that. And it's a pretty minimal change. You probably have to use more than one at different scales in order to really get it to work entirely. So we'll just remove that for now. And we'll go ahead and start mixing with this other one we created. What I'm going to do is add in a blender and connect to that value that we have. And if you don't want a harsher or sharp cutoff on the value, you can switch it over to a gradient, and that gives smoother transitions. I do like the way the value looks in this case. And I also want to add a filter, setting this one to the absolute. That's going to look nice with this filter. And what we're going to do is multiply by 0.05. So it's going to be pretty small, like 0.02, 0.05 should work pretty well. So now we've got a nice combination of both, where we've got the thin lines and also the overall curvature being added. To expand on this further, we can also set up a variable highlight. For this, I'm going to use a connection to the tooth Gaussian, go over to the Highlights tab, make sure Variable Highlights is checked on, and we'll make it a little shinier, a little bit brighter. So now we have a little more variation within the highlight. I probably want to end up changing my connection and switching it to the opposite, connecting to the opposite output of the tooth Gaussian. I'm also going to edit the filter and turn on curves. With this setup, our highlights are more restricted to more of the edges of the different blades. And so what we end up with is a much lighter area on the edge, which does look pretty nice. It almost gives more depth to the single polygon or flat polygons that are being used for each individual blade of grass. If we want to set a minimum, we can go into the filter for the intensity of the highlight. And it looks like it's not letting me move that point. I think that might be a problem because I'm recording, so I'm just going to pause it and move it over to the left. Or we can just, I guess I could set it to -1 in the X. So as I move that upward, or we could set the Y value. Let's do a -0.5. That way we have a minimum amount of highlight that's going to be used. And then the intensity increasing around the edges. So that way we don't lose all highlight. So if we wanted to add even more variation, and this is something I would really only suggest for stills, in animation it probably wouldn't even show up anyway, is to, instead of just connecting to the tooth Gaussian for the highlight, to just connect to the output used for the entire bump. And that way the finer lines will be included in that. I am going to go back to the blender and set that to 0.08 for the multiply to increase the line intensity just a little bit more. If you don't want to multiply it any further, you can also just increase the overall depth, which will also increase the overall curvature of the blade of grass in this case, or any leaf that you're modifying. So this is a pretty neat way to really increase the detail of close-up plants. I am going to go into that highlight and increase the shininess and turn down the global amount. Because I think it was a little too dull in picking up highlights in too many places. So we can make that look a little bit better by making it a little bit shinier. So if you want to apply this to your other vegetation, it works great for especially grass, but it can be used for larger leaves as well. Without having to use a texture map, it does improve certain qualities and reduce some of the rendering time. With the ability to use MIP mapping, because of using texture maps, if you want to use a texture map to do this instead, you could just set up a single gradient along the Y, and that could work pretty well too. If you don't want to modify the bump, for the most part the highlight is being modified by the bump, but you could also just modify the highlight itself and just connect to the highlight channel and have no bump whatsoever, and that can work out pretty well. I'm going to reset the highlight filter, and let's go over to the bump channel and just set it to 0 and just take a look at just the highlights. So basically we're seeing the curvature a bit in some of the areas, the nice variable highlight without having to use the bump. It does take longer to render the bump, so it really depends on the situation, how far you are away from the grass and whether or not the scene is animated. So like I was saying, you can basically use this on any single leaf material, provided that the leaf is straight up and down. Try to keep it centered, otherwise you're going to have to go into that Gaussian, the tooth Gaussian, and offset it in its origin in order to find the right center. But there's a lot of flexibility with it, a lot of cool things you can do.